The snow didn't just cover the battlefield. It erased sound, it swallowed movement, and it hid something the German soldiers on the Eastern Front never believed they'd face. Somewhere in that white silence, a single rifle cracked, then another, then another. Men fell without ever seeing who fired. The advance stopped, and the truth became unavoidable. The enemy they feared most was the one they had dismissed. If you enjoy deeply human war stories like this, consider subscribing. By the winter of 1942, the Eastern Front had become a frozen graveyard of certainty. German commanders had planned for a short war. Speed, shock, and overwhelming force was supposed to break the Soviet Union in months. Instead, the war stretched into years, and winter arrived like an executioner. Temperatures plunged far below zero. Engines froze, fingers stiffened, weapons jammed, and morale, once unshakable, began to crack. The German army still believed in its own myths. One of them was simple, almost casual in its arrogance. Women could not fight, not in real combat, not in brutal conditions, not in winter. Soviet women, they assumed, were propaganda symbols, nurses, factory workers, anything but lethal. On the other side of the line, the Red Army was bleeding. Entire divisions had been shattered. Cities were ashes, families were gone, and survival demanded something radical. The Soviet leadership made a decision born of desperation and ideology. Anyone who could fight would fight. That included women. Tens of thousands volunteered, not because it was easy, but because the alternative was annihilation. Among them were young women trained not for glory, but for patience, for stillness, for hours, sometimes days, without movement, snipers. They learned to breathe slowly through frozen lungs, to press their faces into snow until skin went numb, to sew white camouflage suits that blended perfectly with the landscape. They memorized distances, wind patterns, the subtle difference between a rock and a helmet, and most importantly, they learned to wait. German patrols moving through the snow began to notice something strange. Officers were dropping first, radio operators, machine gunners, men essential to momentum. There was no visible enemy, no charge, no barrage, just sudden death, precise and personal. At first, commanders blamed bad luck, or Soviet men hiding somewhere unseen. Reports mentioning female snipers were laughed off. Winter stress, they said, fear playing tricks on exhausted troops. The idea that young women, some barely out of school, were halting advances felt absurd. But the bodies kept falling. As weeks passed, entire units refused to move without heavy artillery support. Progress slowed to a crawl. Every tree line became a threat. Every ridge felt watched. Soldiers stopped lighting cigarettes. They whispered. They flinched at shadows, and the psychological weight grew heavier than the snow on their shoulders. Moments like this changed history, hit like, so this story reaches more people. For the women behind the scopes, there was no romance in what they did. Many had lost families to bombings or executions. Some had watched their villages burn. Each pull of the trigger was personal, not hatred, focus. They kept tally marks not as trophies, but as proof they were still alive. One sniper would later describe lying motionless for 3 days, snow slowly covering her body, waiting for a single German officer to raise his head. Another spoke of choosing targets based on who looked most confident, because confidence broke morale when it died suddenly. German counter-sniper teams were deployed, dogs were used, artillery shelled suspected positions, but the women adapted. They worked in pairs, one to shoot, one to watch. They used decoys, mirrors, false tracks. Winter, which the Germans believed would break Soviet resistance, became the sniper's greatest ally. Then came the moment that shattered denial. During a planned advance, a German regiment was ordered forward across an open, frozen field. Intelligence claimed the area was clear. Within minutes, the officers were down, one by one. The lines stalled. Men dropped to the ice, unable to see where death was coming from. Panic spread faster than any order could contain. Survivors later reported hearing laughter carried faintly by the wind. Whether it was real or imagined didn't matter. The effect was devastating. For the first time, official reports acknowledged the truth. Female Soviet snipers were operating with deadly efficiency. The myth collapsed too late. The realization was worse than fear. It was humiliation. An army that had built its identity on superiority was being dismantled by an enemy it refused to respect. Orders became cautious. Commanders hesitated. Momentum, everything in blitzkrieg warfare, was gone. Winter dragged on, losses mounted, and the Eastern Front, once seen as a conquest, turned into a trap. The aftermath wasn't just measured in casualties, it was psychological. German soldiers carried the memory of unseen eyes watching from the snow. Soviet women returned from the front forever changed, many carrying scars no parade would ever show. Strategically, the impact was undeniable. Advances slowed, timelines collapsed, resources were diverted, and the Red Army learned a lesson it would carry through the rest of the war. Underestimating an enemy, especially one driven by survival, is fatal. Share this story with someone who thinks WWII outcomes were inevitable. Because history isn't just shaped by generals and maps, it's shaped by moments of arrogance and the people who quietly prove it wrong. The German command tried to adapt, but adaptation came too slowly. Counter-sniper manuals were rewritten in the middle of the war. New orders warned soldiers never to linger, never to expose ranks, never to assume silence meant safety. Yet fear doesn't vanish because it's acknowledged, it deepens. For the women on the Soviet side, survival depended on discipline that bordered on the inhuman. Many were barely in their 20s, some had never fired a rifle before the war. Now they were expected to endure cold that split skin and nights that felt endless. Frostbite was a constant threat. Fingers stiffened, eyelashes froze together. A single mistake meant death, not just for them, but often for their spotter lying inches away. They wrote letters home describing the cold as alive, as if it hunted them too, and still they stayed. What made them effective wasn't strength, it wasn't rage, it was restraint. German soldiers were trained to move fast, to dominate space. Soviet female snipers did the opposite. They erased themselves. They became part of the landscape, snowdrifts, fallen logs, shadows that never shifted. German morale reports began to change tone. Words like unease and invisible enemy appeared more frequently. Veterans who had marched confidently through Europe now hesitated to lift their heads above trenches. Even experienced officers admitted something fundamental had been lost: the sense of control. And control was everything. The psychological impact spread beyond the front lines. Stories circulated through units, some exaggerated, some true, of women who waited days to kill a single man, of snipers who deliberately wounded soldiers to draw others into the open. Whether or not every story was accurate didn't matter. Belief shaped behavior, and belief was crumbling. For the Soviet command, these women became symbols, but not in the way propaganda posters suggested. They were not celebrated while the fighting continued. They were used carefully, deployed where breakthroughs mattered most. Rail lines, river crossings, approach routes to cities already half destroyed. Their presence slowed German operations at precisely the moments when speed was essential. One German officer later wrote that winter itself felt weaponized. "We were fighting not just the enemy," he said, "but our own assumptions." The war ground on, Stalingrad froze, Kursk loomed, and the myth that women could not fight, especially in winter, never fully recovered. When the front finally moved westward, many of these women were pulled back. Some were reassigned, some were wounded, some never returned at all. Those who survived carried quiet burdens. After the war, medals were awarded, speeches were made, but many struggled to fit back into a world that wanted them to forget what they had done. They had learned patience that no civilian life required, silence that felt unnatural, stillness that lingered long after the rifles were put away. For Germany, the cost was irreversible. The Eastern Front consumed men, machines, and confidence. Every delay compounded the disaster. What began as dismissive laughter turned into dread, then into defeat. Underestimating an enemy had consequences measured not just in territory lost, but in lives permanently altered. And for history, the lesson was brutally simple. Wars are not won by who fits expectations. They are won by who adapts, who endures, and who refuses to disappear even when the world insists they should. In the frozen fields of the Eastern Front, the silence told the truth long before the generals did. Long after the snow melted, the consequences remained. Post-war German interrogations revealed something striking. Many soldiers remembered the Eastern Front not for tanks or artillery, but for the feeling of being watched, for the helplessness of knowing skill and courage didn't matter if the enemy never revealed themselves. Veterans spoke of how confidence evaporated, how even hardened troops began to second-guess every movement. Fear had learned patience from their adversary. For the Soviet Union, the legacy was complicated. Official narratives praised heroism, but often softened the truth. The women who survived were expected to return quietly to civilian life, to become daughters, wives, workers again. Some succeeded, many did not. Nightmares lingered. Silence became a habit. A few would later say the cold never truly left their bones. Yet their impact on the war was undeniable. Female snipers accounted for tens of thousands of confirmed kills. More importantly, they changed the tempo of the conflict. They slowed advances, forced rerouting, drained morale, and shattered assumptions that had guided German planning from the start. In a war of resources and time, that disruption mattered. The Eastern Front taught the world something brutal and lasting. Ideology is no armor against reality. The belief that certain people are incapable of violence or resilience can be fatal. The German army learned that lesson in the harshest classroom imaginable. History often remembers battles by dates and places, but sometimes history turns on moments of stillness, on a woman lying motionless in the snow, on a breath held just a second longer, on a decision made in silence. Those moments stopped an advance, and in doing so, they helped change the course of a war that reshaped the world. Years later, when historians tried to explain why the German war machine finally broke in the East, they pointed to logistics, oil shortages, overstretched supply lines, and strategic overreach. All of that was true, but none of it fully captured what happened to the men on the ground. Because wars are not only lost on maps, they are lost inside people. By 1943, German infantry units entering winter terrain no longer saw snow as neutral. It was hostile. Every white expanse felt occupied. Every silence felt intentional. Veterans trained new recruits not just how to move, but how to fear correctly, keep low, never silhouette yourself, assume you are already being watched. That kind of fear is corrosive. It drains initiative. It turns aggressive armies cautious. And caution on the Eastern Front was often fatal. Meanwhile, the Soviet sniper schools quietly expanded. Training became more refined. Instructors, many of them women who had already survived combat, taught camouflage techniques so subtle they bordered on artistry. How to breathe without fogging air, how to pack snow into clothing to break up body heat, how to wait through pain, hunger, even hallucinations. Some students washed out, not because they couldn't shoot, but because they couldn't endure stillness. The ones who graduated understood something rare. Killing was not the hardest part, waiting was. These women were not immune to fear. Before every mission, they felt it. They felt it crawling up their spines as they settled into position, knowing that if they were discovered, death would not be quick. But fear became a tool, not an obstacle. It sharpened attention, it narrowed focus, it made every decision deliberate. German countermeasures grew harsher. Suspected sniper zones were shelled indiscriminately. Villages were destroyed preemptively. Civilians suffered. Yet even this brutality failed to restore the lost sense of dominance. The unseen enemy remained unseen. In letters home, German soldiers wrote less about victory and more about survival, less about ideology and more about exhaustion. Some admitted quietly that they respected the enemy they had once mocked. Respect born not from admiration, but from fear earned the hard way. When the war finally ended, the silence returned to the fields, rifles rusted, snow fell again, indifferent, and the world moved on. But the lesson remained, buried beneath official histories and simplified narratives. The women who fought as snipers on the Eastern Front did more than kill enemy soldiers. They destroyed an illusion that war belongs to one gender, one type of body, one idea of strength. They proved that endurance can be as decisive as force, that patience can break momentum, that arrogance is often the first casualty of war. Their names faded faster than those of generals. Their stories were told briefly, then filed away, but their impact never disappeared. Because every army since has trained its soldiers to fear the unseen. Every modern battlefield accounts for the quiet threat. Every commander understands now what the German High Command learned too late. Underestimate your enemy, and the snow will teach you otherwise. Even today, military psychologists study what happened on the Eastern Front, trying to understand how an army so confident could unravel so completely. They talk about anticipatory fear, about how the expectation of danger can be as paralyzing as danger itself. Few case studies illustrate it better than the winter sniper war. For German soldiers, the battlefield had lost its logic. There was no front line you could see, no enemy mass you could engage. Death came without warning and without pattern. The rules they had trained for speed, aggression, visible dominance no longer worked. And when rules fail, discipline follows. Some units began refusing night movement altogether. Others advanced only under overwhelming artillery cover, wasting precious ammunition and time. Small objectives that once took hours now took days. Each delay fed Soviet defenses, allowing reinforcements to arrive, positions to harden, and counterattacks to form. All of it began with a misjudgment so basic, it feels unbelievable in hindsight. They assumed women would break in winter. Instead, winter broke the assumption. For the Soviet women who survived, memory became complicated. In interviews decades later, many struggled to articulate what they felt about their service. Pride existed, but so did grief. They remembered faces in scopes. They remembered the sound a body makes when it hits frozen ground. They remembered waiting so long they forgot what movement felt like. One former sniper said she knew the war was truly over not when Germany surrendered, but when she could finally stand up without scanning the horizon. Their contribution did not win the war alone, no single force ever does, but it shifted momentum at moments when momentum mattered most. It bought time, it sowed fear, it punished arrogance, and in a conflict defined by extremes, that was enough to matter. History often celebrates the loudest moments, explosions, charges, speeches, but the Eastern Front was also shaped by quiet decisions made in frozen stillness, by individuals who understood that sometimes the most powerful act in war is simply refusing to be seen until it's too late. The German advance slowed, then stalled, then collapsed, not just because of numbers or resources, but because belief failed. And once belief is gone, no army can function as it once did. In the end, the snow kept its secrets, but the lesson remains clear. Never underestimate the enemy you cannot see. Never confuse silence with weakness. And never assume who can or cannot survive war.